Hello everyone, and welcome back to Scary Dark Narrations. Tonight, we are diving deep into a chilling collection of some of the most disturbing true trucker horror stories ever shared from the endless highways and forgotten backroads of America. In this episode, you will hear 7 terrifying encounters told through the experiences of drivers who spent countless nights alone behind the wheel and discovered that some roads hold secrets far darker than anyone could imagine. These are not fictional tales made to scare listeners around a campfire. These stories come from real people who found themselves trapped in situations that still haunt them years later. From isolated rest stops where something waited in the darkness, to abandoned highways where drivers encountered figures that should not have existed, to lonely midnight routes where strange voices crackled through dead radio channels warning them to turn back before it was too late. Life on the road can already feel unsettling. Endless miles of empty pavement, heavy fog swallowing entire stretches of highway, and the constant feeling that someone, or something, may be following just outside the reach of your headlights. But for the people in these stories, the fear became something far more real, something they could not explain and could never forget. To protect the identities of the individuals involved, some names and locations have been changed. However, the terrifying events you are about to hear remain as true and horrifying as the night they happened. There are places truckers refuse to drive through after dark, roads so feared that even experienced drivers avoid speaking about them for too long. And tonight, you are about to discover why. If you are new here, make sure to subscribe to Scary Dark Narrations for more true horror stories guaranteed to leave you unsettled long after the video ends. Turn on notifications so you never miss another descent into the darkness lurking beyond the safety of the headlights. If a warehouse smells like bleach before you even cut the engine, leave. I did not, and now there are nights when I wake up gripping my sheets like a steering wheel, listening for a refrigeration unit that is not outside my house. I had been hauling freight for 11 years by then, and I thought I knew the difference between a strange pickup and a bad feeling I could ignore. Late October proved I did not. I had finished a delivery near Fresno just before dark when dispatch called with a same-night pickup outside Bakersfield. The rate was almost double what I would normally get for a run to Phoenix, and I said yes before I let myself think too hard about it. My daughter's tuition bill was sitting in the visor above me, folded into thirds and soft at the corners from being handled too much. Need has a way of sanding down instinct until it feels almost reasonable. The address belonged to something called Kern Valley Industrial Storage, about 30 miles southeast of Bakersfield. The closer I got, the more the road thinned out, until pavement gave up and turned to a narrow dirt track between empty fields. What bothered me first was how my hands took the final turn a second before the GPS voice told me to. I remember glancing at the screen and thinking the map was just lagging. The building at the end of that road looked less like a business than something left behind by one. Rust had bled down the siding in long orange tears, weeds pushed through the cracked lot, and the only sign was a small metal placard by the door that said KVI Storage. A single floodlight over the dock flattened everything into hard white edges. There were 2 pickup trucks, one dead-looking refrigerated trailer off to the side, and several men moving in the shadows with the kind of economy that makes you feel watched even when nobody looks at you. They were dressed too heavily for the weather. Dark work clothes, thick gloves, sleeves buttoned down tight at the wrists. When I asked where to check in, one of them lifted a hand and pointed me toward a side office without speaking. Their silence did not feel rude, it felt practiced. Inside, the office looked stranded in another decade. Metal desks, green filing cabinets, a water-stained ceiling, and walls covered in charts that seemed part medical diagram, part inventory code. A round clock hung over the desk, stopped at 12:17, the second hand parked against the glass as if it had tried to move and failed. I noticed it because everything else in that room looked neglected. but the clock face had been wiped clean. Mr. Patterson sat behind the desk with a clipboard balanced on one knee. He was a thin man in his 50s, pale around the mouth, with the kind of polite voice that never relaxes. When he looked up at me, he said, "Good, you came back," and then corrected himself without even smiling. "You came out fast." He pushed the paperwork across the desk and kept tapping the signature lines with his pen until I stopped trying to read the fine print. I asked him what I was hauling, and he said processed meat products for specialty restaurants in Phoenix. He did not look at me when he said it. He told me to keep the trailer at 35 degrees exactly, as if 1 degree either way would ruin everything. When I asked to inspect the load before they sealed it, he said health regulations would not allow it. The smell in that building got stronger the longer I stayed. It was bleach, yes, but not the sharp, clean kind from a hospital hallway. Under it was something warmer and sweeter, almost spoiled, and every now and then the air shifted and brought it close enough to taste. Beyond a heavy curtain of clear plastic deeper in the warehouse, machinery ran in uneven bursts, followed by scraping, a thud, then a sound so faint I almost wrote it off as ventilation, until it happened again and held the shape of a voice. Nothing in that office felt current. The desks were old, the light buzzed, the stopped clock watched the room without moving, and my phone kept brightening in my pocket with messages from my daughter asking if I was still driving. I typed back that I would call from the road, then erased it, then typed it again. While I was doing that, Patterson took a phone call in a lowered voice and said, "Batch 7 is complete. Disposal truck comes at 3. Area 4 needs sanitization before morning." The loading took almost 2 hours. Workers moved in and out behind the plastic sheeting carrying white crates and long stainless carts, and every time the curtain opened, cold air touched my face and retreated. Patterson kept me in the office, talking just enough to keep me sitting there, and never enough to answer anything. By the end of it, my skin had started to feel over-aware, as if the whole building had narrowed around me and was waiting for one wrong movement. When they finally finished, Patterson handed me the final set of papers and walked me toward the dock. I had to pass close to the plastic barrier on the way out, and one corner had come loose from the floor. I did not mean to look through it. I only saw enough to understand the lie. There was a metal table under a surgical light, and on the end of it hung a human foot with a strip of hospital tape still around the ankle. The skin was gray in the bright light, the toes angled slightly inward, and somebody in scrubs was standing over it with both gloved hands inside a stainless tray. For one suspended second, my mind kept trying to call it pork or a mannequin or anything else that would let me keep breathing normally. Then the person in scrubs turned, and I saw a wrist with a blue patient band laid beside a row of instruments. I kept walking because every instinct I had said that stopping would make me visible in a new way. My legs carried me back to the truck with a careful, stupid steadiness that felt borrowed from somebody calmer. Behind me, the trailer doors slammed shut, metal on metal, and the workers sealed the load. By the time I climbed into the cab, I knew there was human cargo locked behind me, and the sweet chemical smell had already followed me inside. I drove until the warehouse lights disappeared in the mirrors, then pulled onto the shoulder and called 911 with fingers that did not want to hit the right numbers. I gave the dispatcher the address, the name on the paperwork, the man I had spoken to, and the one clear image I could not stop seeing, a human foot under a surgical lamp. She listened without interrupting, and that made it worse. When she finally spoke, she told me detectives wanted me to keep driving as scheduled and meet them at a truck stop outside Barstow so the people back at the warehouse would not know they had been seen. So I got back on the road with a sealed, refrigerated trailer and the knowledge that something butchered was riding behind me in labeled containers. The reefer unit kicked on with a low mechanical shudder that rolled up through the cab floor and into my legs. I had heard that sound thousands of times in my career, but that night it felt intimate, like breath moving through teeth. Every time it cycled, my shoulders locked a little tighter. The highway was mostly empty, just long black stretches and the occasional glare of another truck passing the other direction. I kept checking my mirrors as if the doors might swing open or someone might be standing on the rear bumper. My daughter called once, then again 10 minutes later, and I let both calls ring out because I knew she would hear something wrong in my voice. Her missed calls sat on the screen like accusations. At some point, I looked down at the dash clock, expecting to see a little past 2. For a blink, maybe less, the numbers showed 12:17. Then they corrected themselves to 2:08, as if nothing had happened. I told myself I was overtired, that I had been breathing bleach and diesel for too many hours, that minds under stress do small, dishonest things. I started paying attention to my own thoughts, the way you listen for a problem in an engine. The turn onto that dirt road kept replaying in my head, that half second when my hands already knew where to go. Then Patterson Slip did the same thing. You came back. Not came out. Back. I pulled into a rest area south of Mojave because I could not stand being sealed in the cab with my imagination any longer. The night air was cold and dry, the kind that usually clears your head, but the moment I stepped near the trailer, I smelled that same layered odor coming off the metal doors. The seal was intact. There was a fogged patch low on the right door where the cold from inside had condensed against the outside air, and across it was a smear shaped almost like the side of a hand, too broad for a glove, too high for road spray. I stood there longer than I should have, listening. At first, there was only the hum of the unit and the ticking of cooling metal. Then something shifted inside with a soft, sliding thump, followed by 3 quick knocks from deeper in the load. Not loud, not dramatic, just enough to make every part of my body understand that whatever was behind those doors had once belonged to people who resisted being arranged. I got back in the truck and drove harder than I should have. Distance became the only thing that felt useful, even though the trailer remained the same fixed weight behind me, no matter how many miles I put under it. A green highway sign for Barstow came and went, then another. The road should have felt familiar by then, but instead it started to take on the flat, unreal quality of a dream you know you have had before. The truck stop was bright in the ugliest possible way. All sodium lights and wet concrete and tired people moving around coffee counters. Detectives met me beside the fuel island with an FBI agent and a coroner's team already waiting near the back of my trailer. None of them wasted words trying to calm me down. They read the seal number, photographed everything, and opened the doors. Cold rolled out first, dense enough to feel. Then came the smell, stronger now, trapped and concentrated for hours inside a metal box. The cargo was stacked in white coolers and heavy plastic containers secured with straps, each one numbered, dated, and marked with abbreviations that looked medical once you knew what you were looking at. One of the detectives pulled the lid off the nearest cooler, and the whole line of people around me seemed to lean away by the same inch. I do not think about the contents as body parts anymore. That is too simple, almost merciful. What I remember are the details around them. Handwriting on specimen tape, blood types printed in block letters, condensation running over barcodes, a wedding ring bagged separately in a corner tray as if it had been removed and inventoried like packaging. The FBI agent swore under his breath, very softly, and then nobody said anything for several seconds. They took me inside the diner and sat me in a back booth with burnt coffee and a paper napkin I kept shredding without noticing. The agent asked me to walk through every minute from Fresno to Bakersfield to the truck stop. Then he asked if I was certain I had never hauled for KVI before. I told him yes, so quickly it almost sounded offended. He slid a printed sheet across the table. It was a GPS movement log from my company truck 6 months earlier, showing my tractor stopped at the same rural address southeast of Bakersfield for 43 minutes just after midnight. Under that was a grainy security still from a gate camera, time-stamped 12:17, with my truck number visible on the sleeper and Mr. Patterson standing at the driver's window with a clipboard in his hand. I kept looking at the picture because the man in the cab was me and was not me. Same cap, same beard, same forearm draped out the window, but my face had that blank, long-haul expression I only get when I am driving too tired and too long and telling myself I am still fine. The agent said the network had used independent drivers repeatedly because repetition made them invisible. Routine made them forgettable. Then he showed me a temperature log recovered from one of the containers in my trailer. My initials were on it in my own handwriting. 35 degrees, exactly. The investigations spread across 3 states and filled months of my life with fluorescent rooms, sworn statements, evidence photos, and the kind of silence that follows official language when everybody in the room knows words are failing. They told me the warehouse was part of an organ trafficking network that targeted people whose disappearances would not trigger immediate alarm. Homeless men, undocumented workers, women who had slipped out of shelters and never been reported by anyone with leverage. The operation moved them through places disguised as storage sites and food processors because most people do not look twice at cold freight. What kept hollowing me out was not just what I had seen that night. It was what I had probably failed to see before it. The records suggested that my company had been used more than once, and that I had already hauled at least one prior load from the same building during a week when I had been stacking overnight runs and living on gas station coffee. The mind protects itself in ugly ways. Sometimes it does not forget the thing that happened. Sometimes it forgets the version of you that kept driving after the first warning. That last turn off the paved road was the first warning. I did not guess it. My hands remembered it. And when Patterson looked up and said, "You came back," he was not misspeaking. He recognized me before I recognized the place. The FBI agent said fatigue can blur memory, especially in work that repeats itself mile after mile, dock after dock, signature after signature. He meant it kindly, like a man trying to hand me a smaller burden than the one I was already carrying. But kindness did not help. All I could think about was how easily a human being can become useful to evil without ever feeling monstrous, just tired and underpaid and a little too grateful for double-rate freight. The clock troubled me more than it should have. It was stopped at 12:17 in the office, and the gate camera still they showed me from my earlier visit was also stamped 12:17, even though the agent told me later that the camera system had been running on a different internal time and should not have matched the wall clock at all. When investigators recovered the office clock, there was no battery inside it. Nobody else cared about that detail. I cared because after that night, I started waking at 12:17 often enough that my wife, before she left, used to turn the clock away from the bed. At trial, they kept the evidence language clinical, but ordinary objects kept breaking through the categories. A bus pass, a laminated prayer card, a chipped keychain shaped like a cartoon strawberry. Personal things stripped away and logged because the bodies they belonged to had been treated as inventory. I would sit there listening and think about the sealed trailer behind me on the road to Barstow, the suspension flexing over every dip, and feel again the disgusting calm with which I had once accepted a dispatcher saying, "Specialty meat products." My daughter knows the broad outline of what happened. She knows I reported a criminal operation and testified in a federal case. She does not know that when her mini-fridge kicked on during her first semester, I had to leave her dorm room and stand in the hallway because the sound was too close to the unit on my trailer that night. She thought I was carsick from the drive. I let her think that, because some forms of guilt are hereditary if you speak them aloud. I went back to trucking after 6 months, but not to the same company and not the same kind of freight. I only haul dry loads now, mostly customers I know by name, places with daylight offices and open dock doors and invoices that read like what they are. If somebody offers me sealed, refrigerated freight from a facility I have never heard of, I do not care how desperate I am or how good the money looks. Need is still persuasive, but now it has to argue with memory. Even so, the road keeps finding ways to repeat itself. Every few months, a broker app on my phone will light up with a late-night hot load to Phoenix, double rate, commodity listed in useless language like specialty product or restaurant material. Once, 2 years after the arrests, the pickup city was just outside Bakersfield, and the contact email began with KVI. Maybe it was an old listing, stuck in a system nobody scrubbed clean. Maybe it was a copycat. Maybe there are names that do not die when the people behind them go to prison. I deleted that offer without opening it, but I did not sleep that night. I sat in the dark cab at a rest area in New Mexico and watched trucks come and go under a single floodlight, while the smell of bleach seemed to pulse in and out of the air vents, even with the fan off. Across the lot, a refrigerated trailer started up with that same low, shuddering hum, and for one sick instant, I knew the sequence before it happened. The cold breath of the unit, the thump of something settling, the hard white light over a dock door. My body knew it the way it had known that dirt road. If a warehouse smells like bleach before you even cut the engine, leave. That is what I tell younger drivers now, and they usually laugh the way people laugh when advice sounds too dramatic to belong to ordinary life. I do not argue with them. I just watch their faces and wonder how many terrible systems survive because they learn the shape of ordinary work and hide inside it. Most nights I can sleep. Some nights I wake at 12:17 with both hands locked around an invisible wheel, already making that turn before any voice tells me to. In the dream, the road is empty, the fields are black, and the warehouse is waiting with its one clean clock face and its single floodlight, and a man at the office desk looking up as if he never doubted I would return. The worst part is not what is in the trailer behind me. The worst part is the feeling that the road has remembered me, and that somewhere out there, under another name, it is still loading. There is 1 mile of road in Montana I still cannot remember, and a stranger on my CB knew that before I did. Before he told me what he wanted, he reached into the part of my life I had been keeping turned face down. I had been a long-haul driver for 14 years, and that night I was eastbound on Interstate 94 through North Dakota, hauling farm equipment toward Minneapolis under a sky the color of old dishwater. By the time I got near Jamestown, the fields on both sides had gone flat and blind. Snow was beginning to tap at the windshield, and a voice I had never heard before said my name like he had been practicing it. Out on the road, you learn how easy it is to hand pieces of yourself to strangers. Channel 19 is weather, speed traps, accidents, boredom. And if it gets too crowded, I always slide over to Channel 17 because it is usually quieter there. Sandra had hung a pine tree air freshener over my dash the Christmas before, and even after the smell died, I left it there because it moved with the cab like a small living thing. If traffic held and the snow stayed light, I would make Minneapolis late and pick up the key for room 237 at the motel beside the TA, the one with the heater loud enough to drown out the freeway. I had another reason for liking noise. 18 months earlier, on Route 2 in Montana, I had swerved in a storm for what I thought was a deer, felt something hit, climbed down into rain so hard it bounced off the asphalt, and found nothing I could understand. Weeks later, a trooper came to my house asking where I had been that night, and when the questions dried up, I told myself that meant the road had lied to me, not that I had missed something important. Since then, weather that erased the shoulder got under my skin. A dark road in bad rain could make me feel like the world had edges I was not seeing. That evening, the wind was leaning into my trailer hard enough to make the whole rig breathe sideways. Static crackled in the speaker. Then a man said, almost cheerful, "Well, well, look what rolled eastbound tonight. Montana Rick in that pretty blue Peterbilt." I checked my mirrors so fast I almost drifted onto the rumble strip. but all I saw were a few scattered headlights and one truck hanging well back. I keyed the mic and said, "This is Rick. Who am I talking to?" He laughed once, low and mean, like he enjoyed how polite I was still trying to be. "You do not need my name. I know yours. I know what you are hauling. And I know you live in Billings with Sandra and those 2 kids of yours." My hands stayed on the wheel, but the tendons in my wrists felt pulled tight as cable. People hear truckers on the radio all the time, sure, but not like that. Not in a voice that already sounded familiar with the inside of your house. I told him he had me mixed up with somebody else. He ignored that and said, "Marker 258 eastbound, grain elevator 3 miles back on your right. Your truck is looking filthy, Rick." I looked down at the mile marker sign sliding by in my headlights, then up at the gray wall of evening pressing against the glass. He was watching me. The cab felt smaller after that, like the windows had moved an inch inward without making a sound. I said he needed to stop, and my voice came out flatter than I meant it to. He answered in the same relaxed tone, which somehow made it worse, and said he had been following drivers like me for months, learning habits, finding the pressure points, deciding who scared easiest. When he said Sandra's name again, and then the names of my kids, the road ahead lost its ordinary shape and became something arranged for me by somebody else. Every pair of headlights in my mirrors started to feel like an eye that had finally found the right distance. I called 911 on my cell and kept driving with the wheel trembling faintly under my palms from the crosswind. The dispatcher was kind, but there was not much she could do with a voice on a CB and no plate number, no face, no certain vehicle. She told me to change channels, stop using my handle, and keep moving toward a populated area. So I switched the radio over to 17 and did not say a word at first, just listened to static and tire noise and my own breathing inside the cab. For maybe 3 minutes, nothing happened. I let myself believe I had slipped sideways out of his reach. Then the speaker snapped alive and he said very softly, "Channel 17, just like always." I had not touched the mic, but my hand went up by reflex to steady the dead pine tree swinging over the dash, and he whispered, "Leave it alone, Rick. You are making it tap the glass." After that, I stopped pretending this was ordinary harassment. I jumped to 21, then 12, then 6, waiting longer each time before I spoke, trying to disappear into the static, and every time he found me anyway. Sometimes he answered before I even finished a sentence, as if he had been sitting with his finger over the trigger, listening for the first scrape of my voice. The farther east I drove, the less the highway felt like distance. It felt like exposure. He started reciting my life in pieces, the way a mechanic lays parts on a clean rag before he puts them back together wrong. A speeding ticket in Wyoming I never mentioned at home. A delivery to Denver the month before. Then he said, "Tell that waitress in Iowa you are married next time." And the inside of my chest gave one hard, painful thump. That was not something you could pull from public records or hear from casual radio chatter. It had been nothing that would impress anybody from the outside. Just flirtation at a Flying J, a smile I stayed too long for, a version of myself that showed up on lonely runs and disappeared when I turned west again. Still, hearing it spoken in that voice made it feel filthy and deliberate. The worst part was not that he knew. The worst part was realizing he had watched me during moments I had already been trying to forgive myself for. By the time he said, "I want you afraid every time you touch that wheel," I was gripping it so hard the seams pressed into my skin. Then his tone changed. It dropped lower, lost the sneer, and turned into something raw enough to sound rehearsed by grief. "You killed my brother on Route 2 in Montana," he said, and the windshield in front of me might as well have been rain again. That stretch of memory has never come back in one piece. I remember wipers smearing water into sheets, the center line wavering, the shape of something pale at the edge of the beams, then an impact I assigned to a deer because I needed it to be a deer. I remember standing on the shoulder with rain running down the back of my neck, flashlight shaking in my hand, seeing no body, no bike, no blood, nothing except wet road and the breathing engine of my truck. Memory is not a courtroom. It is a room with one bad bulb swinging overhead. He told me his brother had lain in the rain for hours. He said police found paint from my truck, tire marks that matched my rig, and a body cooling under weather I had driven away from. I told him I had never known, and I meant it, but the truth sounded thin even to me once it was out in the cab with us. There are things you can survive saying to another man. There are things you cannot survive hearing yourself say. When I finally rolled toward the Minneapolis area, sodium lights began to gather in the distance, and I caught myself thinking I would be safer once I was near people. That was when he came back and said, almost pleasantly, "TA on Highway 10, right, Rick? Same motel next door, room 237 if they have it." I had not told anyone where I planned to stop. I parked under bright lights anyway, called the police again, and when they advised me to stay somewhere else for the night, I drove to a different motel and lay awake with my shoes on until dawn. The harassment did not end there. It widened. He called my house and hung up when Sandra answered, mailed photographs of my family at grocery stores and school pickup lines, and described what my son had worn to baseball practice before the boy had even made it home. Sometimes on the radio, he would play old recordings of my own voice back to me, snippets of weather talk and jokes and idle confessions from hundreds of miles and months ago. And there were nights I could not tell whether I was answering him or answering myself. Sandra knew something was wrong long before I said the word stalking out loud. She would ask why I kept checking the windows, why I flinched when the house phone rang, why I slept like somebody was standing beside the bed, reading. I told her enough to frighten her, but not enough to shame myself, and that made everything between us feel bent. A week after the Minneapolis run, a padded envelope arrived with no return address and a motel notepad tucked inside. On the cassette labeled 237, I heard the heater rattle, the television murmur, the creak of the mattress, and then my own voice in the dark saying Sandra's name, the way a man says it when he thinks nobody is being allowed to hear him. The calls and the radio traffic went on for 6 months. By then, the FBI had stepped in, mostly because the threat had crossed enough state lines and touched enough phones and radios to become bigger than one patrol report in one county. They wired my truck, taught me how to keep a man talking without sounding like I was trying to keep him talking, and told me that if he came back, I was to stay calm long enough for the signal to breathe. When he finally did, somewhere in western Minnesota, he said, "Tonight is the night, Rick," in a voice so level it sounded like a weather report. I answered him the way they had coached me, but fear has its own script, and I was not faking much. I asked him about his brother, about the storm, about what he thought I deserved, and he kept talking because grievance likes an audience. The trace took longer than it felt, and time inside a cab has a way of stretching when you know other people are listening to the same speaker you are. Then state police closed on a pickup about 15 miles south of me, and a man named Robert Kowalski came out of it with a high-powered radio setup, cameras, notebooks, and enough patience packed into the back seat to make me sick. The house search was worse than the arrest report. They found file boxes full of drivers arranged by handle, route, company, and weakness, pages of habits written in tight block letters, and photographs of men eating alone under truck stop TVs with no idea anybody was memorizing them. My box was thicker than the rest. There were maps with my usual fuel stop circled, copies of public records, school information on my kids, stills from motel parking lots, and stacks of recorded conversations he had indexed by date, weather, and emotional state. One notebook had a section just for fallback behavior. Next to my name, Robert had written, 17 when crowded, 17 when rattled, 17 when he wants privacy, which means 17 when he gets honest. On those tapes, I heard myself become smaller version by version, telling strangers things I would not say at my own kitchen table because the road had taught me that faceless voices felt safer than people who loved me. Channel 17 had never been a quieter place. It had been a confession booth with no door. Room 237 was in there too. They found motel receipts under false names, copies of old key cards, a sketch of the wall vent and heater cover, and a line in his notes that read, 237, apology starts after lights out. The agents told me he had likely planted a recorder in the unit and removed it before anybody searched, which was meant to calm me down by making the thing practical. It did not help. Practical horror just means somebody had time. At trial, I learned the part of the story Robert had built his life around. His brother had died in a collision during a storm on Route 2, yes, but the investigation had never proven I was the driver involved, and there was less certainty in the evidence than Robert had fed himself over the years. There was also a photograph of me at a Wyoming fuel island taken months before his brother died, which meant he had been collecting truckers before he ever chose me for revenge. Grief had given him a reason. Obsession had given him a method. He went to prison for stalking, harassment, terroristic threats, and a list of other charges that sounded satisfying only on paper. Nothing about the sentence gave me back the part of my mind that had learned to scan parking lots before getting out of a vehicle. I left long-haul work not long after the trial and took a local driving job with a construction outfit. Daylight hours, short routes, no motels, no overnight runs. I told myself I was done with radios that let strangers in. What I was really done with was the version of myself that thought routine was the same thing as safety. I stopped using my handle. I stopped talking about my family over any open channel. I never stayed in the same place twice if I could help it, and I never hung another pine tree air freshener in any cab I drove. Still, when cold weather comes and the heater first pushes that dry, manufactured warmth across the dash, I feel my shoulders draw tight before I know why. Last winter, I was backing a county dump truck into a salt shed before sunrise, a truck with no CB installed anywhere in it, just a weather band and a crackling company speaker. Snow was feathering through the work lights, and for a second the vents gave off that same dead chemical pine smell I had not let near me in years. Then the speaker hissed. A voice worn almost flat by static said, "Channel 17, Rick," and every part of me turned toward it the way a man turns toward his own name in a crowd. There is still 1 mile of road in Montana I cannot remember. I know now it does not stay in Montana. The first thing that went wrong was my truck clock started giving time back. Every time the dash lights flickered, 11:14 slipped to 11:13 again, like the night was taking a small bite out of itself and making me drive through the same minute twice. I had been hauling paper product down Highway 80 for 10 years by then, from a mill outside Monroe to the port in Savannah, and I knew that road the way some people know the floor plan of their childhood home. That is why the wrongness settled into me early, before I ever touched the brake. It had already been a bad run. Loading dock delays put me behind before sunset. Construction chewed up another hour, and the electrical issue in my Freightliner kept pulsing through the dash in little nervous blinks that made the cab feel less like a machine and more like something with a weak heartbeat. October is hard on me anyway, because it is the month my father died out on the road when I was 6, and long night drives have a way of loosening old thoughts you keep packed down during the day. I kept his silver lighter in the cup holder for company, though I have never smoked a day in my life. By the time I hit the halfway stretch, I was low enough on fuel to stop pretending I could gamble it. The gauge was sitting under a quarter tank. The clock kept returning to 11:13, and every truck stop I trusted was either behind me or close to closing their fuel island. Then I saw an exit sign cut through the dark on the right shoulder. Truck Plaza, 24 hours. I had driven that stretch of Highway 80 more than 200 times, and I had never seen that sign before. That should have been enough to keep me on the interstate. Instead, I took the ramp, because empty tanks make cowards of people who usually trust their instincts. The road bent away from the highway and narrowed into 2 lanes hemmed in by pine woods, and the further I went, the quieter it got. until even my own engine noise seemed wrapped in trees. About 2 miles in, sodium lights appeared ahead through the trunks, warm and low and steady, and I felt the kind of relief that makes your shoulders hurt when it finally arrives. The place looked ordinary in the way lonely places work hard to look ordinary. There were maybe 20 parking spaces, a fuel island with older pumps under a flat awning, and a restaurant attached to the main building with yellow light in the windows and silhouettes moving behind the glass. A few trucks were already parked there, enough to make it feel safe but not crowded, and from the driver's seat, I could almost laugh at myself for getting spooked by a road sign. I shut off the engine, grabbed my card, and went inside to prepay. The wrongness started with the decor. The walls were wood-paneled. The carpet was a tired orange-brown that looked older than me, and the register behind the counter had big square buttons and mechanical numbers that flipped over with a hard little clack. The woman at the register wore a beehive hairdo and pale lipstick, and she smiled at me like she had known me for years. When I handed her my company fuel card, she turned it over in both hands and frowned at it with polite confusion before saying they only took cash. There was an ATM in the corner by the restaurant entrance, and even that looked wrong in the same quiet way. The screen glowed green, the buttons were thick and yellowed, and the machine made a string of chirping beeps like a hospital monitor from an old movie before it finally pushed out the bills. I paid, went back outside, and started pumping fuel into my tanks while the pine trees stood around the lot like a dark wall. Then I saw the trucks. Not old in the way some owner-operators keep old rigs alive out of pride. I mean old the way museum pieces are old, with boxier cabs, bright paint jobs you do not see anymore, and chrome stacks polished to a shine that looked almost theatrical under those lights. One was a late 70s Peterbilt that looked fresh off a calendar, and another had a CB whip taller than the cab, and a company logo I had not seen since I was a kid riding in my uncle's pickup. I stood there with diesel fumes around me and the nozzle humming in my hand, trying to tell myself it was some kind of trucker nostalgia stop. The restaurant made that explanation harder to hold on to. It had red vinyl booths, a jukebox in the corner spinning out a country song from long before I was born, and waitresses in little white aprons moving between tables with coffee pots in their hands. The chalkboard menu listed coffee for 50 cents, burgers for $2, and slices of pie for a price that made no sense in 2023. I sat at the counter for a coffee anyway, because part of me still wanted one normal thing to happen before I got back on the road. The customers were talking too loudly for me not to hear them, and every sentence seemed to scrape against what I knew. Men in trucker caps complained about 80-cent fuel like it was robbery, argued about CB channels, and named companies that had disappeared decades ago. A driver in a booth near the window looked over at me and said to his friend, not bothering to lower his voice, that the new girl sure was dressed funny, and that my truck looked like something from outer space. I set a $5 bill under my cup, and the waitress stared at it for half a second too long before she took it. Outside, the air felt colder than it had any right to. I did my pre-trip faster than usual, just wanting to get back to the highway, but one of the parked drivers started walking toward me before I could climb in. He was in his 60s, maybe, broad in the shoulders, wearing a flannel shirt and a cap with a patch from a company I did not recognize. And he moved with the slow confidence of someone standing in his own front yard. He looked up at my Freightliner, grinned, and asked me what year it was, because he had never seen one built like that. I told him it was a 2019. He laughed at first, but the laugh died almost as soon as it left him, and his face settled into something gentler, almost concerned, like I was the one who had gotten turned around. Then he shook his head and said, "Come on now, girl, it is only 1983. For a second, the whole lot sounded hollow, like the world had been scooped out from behind the noise. I could hear the fluorescent hum under the awning, grease popping in the diner kitchen, a truck door slamming somewhere behind me, and all of it felt too separate, too clear, as if I had stepped into a place built out of details instead of time. I pulled my phone from my back pocket and looked at the black screen. No service, no bars, no date, Not even the home screen wallpaper when I hit the button, just my own face staring back at me faintly in dead glass. I climbed into my cab and locked the door. The dash lights fluttered once, then steadied, and the clock stayed fixed at 11:13, no matter how long I looked at it. I put the truck in gear and drove out of the lot, past the diner, past the old rigs, past the sign at the road that should have led me back to Highway 80. 5 minutes later, I passed the same dented mailbox leaning under the same pine, and then the truck stop lights opened up in front of me again. I had not turned around. I stopped so hard my coffee sloshed across the lid and onto my jeans. The road behind me was one thin strip of black between the trees, but I knew what I had driven, and I knew what I was seeing, and those two things would not fit together in the same head. By then, the air in the cab had changed too, carrying a sweetness under the diesel and old coffee, something like burned sugar and hot plastic. I went back inside because standing alone in that parking lot felt worse than facing people who spoke like the Reagan years had never ended. The heat in the building hit me harder the second time, and the place smelled less like food now and more like wiring inside a wall. Near the register, there was a corkboard cluttered with Polaroids, handwritten notes, and business cards pinned in crooked rows. One of the photos had curled at the corners with age, and the man smiling out of it was my father at 28, leaning against a blue rig with my silver lighter raised in one hand. My mother had kept exactly one picture of him out where I could see it when I was little. Same jaw, same tired eyes, same crease by the mouth that showed up when he was trying not to smile too much. I remembered tracing the initials on that lighter after they mailed it back to us with the rest of his things, long before I was old enough to understand what effects meant in a letter. When I stepped closer to the board, the waitress beside the coffee urn looked up at me and said, as casually as if she were telling me where the restroom was, "You kin to Ray Cole? He is out by pump 3. The word I wanted stayed trapped behind my teeth. I walked back outside because not walking felt impossible, and there he was, younger than every memory I had of him, standing beside a truck with one boot on the step and a paper cup in his hand. He turned when he heard the door close behind me, and for one terrible second I saw my own face in him. Not the features exactly, but the shape of exhaustion around the eyes, the way some people seem born already carrying distance in them. He smiled politely and asked if I was all right, and I stood there with my father alive in front of me and could not make my mouth form a single honest word. I fumbled for the lighter in my pocket just to have something solid to hold. My thumb flicked it open and shut once by habit, and that small metallic click made him glance down at my hand. He let out a soft breath through his nose and said he used to have one that sounded just like that, but he kept leaving it places and it always found its way back to him. When I looked down at the lighter, the metal was warm enough to sting. Then the lot shifted. It did not change all at once, nothing that generous, just little breaks in the surface of things that made the rest of it impossible to trust. The diner windows flashed black for a fraction of a second, not reflecting the parking lot but swallowing it. And in that blink I saw soot-rimmed glass and the pale shape of people standing too still behind it. The jukebox inside skipped on the same line 3 times, and each time it restarted, I heard different voices under the music, overlapping in a low murmur that kept landing on the same 2 words. New girl. I backed away from my father before I even understood I was doing it. Everyone in the restaurant had turned toward the window now. Not dramatically, not like in a movie, just the slow attention of people noticing somebody arrive late to something important. The cashier with the beehive hair was no longer smiling, and the waitress, who had pointed me toward Ray, looked frightened for the first time since I had seen her. When I glanced at my dash through the windshield, my fuel gauge had fallen back under a quarter tank, as if I had never filled it at all. That was when the place stopped feeling like a mistake and started feeling hungry. The waitress pushed through the front door and came 2 steps into the lot, apron fluttering in the cool air, and told me in a low voice that if I was only passing through, I needed to keep passing through. Behind her, the diner lights trembled, and for a breath, the smell of burning grease turned sharp and black, thick enough that I could taste it at the back of my throat. My father looked toward the restaurant then, not at me, with an expression so tired and familiar that it hurt worse than fear. I ran for my truck. The engine turned over on the first try, but the lights inside the cab dimmed so low I thought they were going to die, and in the side mirror I saw the parking lot as a ruin for one clean second. Pumps split open, fire climbing the awning, men standing beside trucks that were already only frames. My father was there among them with one hand lifted, and I still do not know if he was warning me away or asking me to stay. I drove straight into the dark road between the pines, through a band of smoke that should not have existed, and when I hit the interstate again, the clock on my dash jumped from 11:13 to 2:41, like 3 hours had been torn out and thrown somewhere I could never reach. I did not pull over until I saw the lights of Savannah bleeding into the sky. My thumb was blistered where it had gripped the lighter, and when I flipped the lid open under the cab light, there was a single paper match tucked inside the casing that had not been there before. The match head was blackened, and on the stem was a little green pine tree with "Pine Woods" printed under it in faded ink. I held it in my palm the rest of the way to the port and kept my eyes off every exit sign on the road. I delivered the load on muscle memory. My dispatcher called while I was backing into the bay, and I told him enough of the truth to hear how bad it sounded in another person's silence. He said I looked exhausted when I checked in on the yard camera and told me to get some sleep before I started inventing ghosts on a state route. I did not argue with him because I still smelled smoke in my hair and there was a blister on my thumb shaped like the lighter's hinge. The next morning, in daylight, everything I had seen felt thinner but not safer. I called the Department of Transportation and asked about a truck stop off Highway 80 near the stretch where I had exited, and the woman I spoke to told me there was nothing there but woods and private land. I drove back the following week anyway, around noon, with a full tank and enough caffeine in me to make my hands shake. The exit sign was gone, and when I took the nearest road into the pines, all I found was an empty field with scrub grass, old concrete buried under dirt, and trees pressing in from every side like they had been reclaiming the place for years. The first person who gave me anything useful was an older owner-operator at a terminal outside Dublin. I asked him if he had ever heard of a place called Pine Woods Plaza, and his face changed in that old road way where people try to decide whether to protect you or themselves. He said there used to be a truck stop by that name out off Highway 80, popular in the early 80s, until a fire tore through the restaurant and reached the pumps. He also said drivers still swapped stories about seeing lights in the trees there when they were too tired, too low on fuel, or too lonely to trust their own judgment. I spent 2 nights in motel rooms digging through archived local newspapers and scanning whatever records had survived online. The dates were messy, which only made it worse, because some articles said late 1983 and others said January of 1984, like even the official version could not keep the event pinned down. One short column from a county paper listed the suspected start time of the fire at 11:13 p.m. and named 6 dead, 3 injured, and 1 driver missing but presumed to have been sleeping in his cab when the blaze spread across the lot. The missing driver was Ray Cole, my father, and the wreck my mother had given me when I was 6 was just the version of his death she could live with. After that, I went back to my truck and sat there a long time without starting it. The lighter was in the cup holder where I always left it, looking harmless and dull in daylight, but the inside smelled faintly of old grease and wet ash when I opened it. Tucked beneath the felt pad was the same Pine Woods match, scorched at the tip, with a grease stain on the paper as if it had spent years in somebody's work shirt. I had carried that lighter for more than 2 decades, and I know with the ugly certainty people reserve for grief that the match had not been there before that night. That changed the meaning of everything, in ways I still do not enjoy putting into words. The clock on my dash had not been malfunctioning. It had been dragging me toward the minute when the place split open, the minute the road was thin enough to pass through. And when those men in the diner called me the new girl, they were not just mocking my clothes or my truck. They were naming me, the way people name weather coming in, as something they had been taught to recognize before it arrives. I do not think I drove into the past exactly. I think I drove into the part of it that refused to finish burning. Pine Woods did not feel like a memory, and it did not feel like a haunting in the simple way people use that word when they want a clean shape around. The smell reached me before the trailer did, and it was not the smell of anything that should still be on a delivery schedule. By the time a man in a white hooded suit handed me a clipboard outside Flint and told me not to break the seal, I was already thinking about a winter at my grandfather's cabin that I had not let myself think about in 20 years. I had been driving truck for 12 years by then, long enough to know that sealed loads usually meant paperwork and liability, not fear. But I was behind on child support, taking ugly runs because ugly runs paid fast, and that warehouse looked less like freight and more like a place built to keep a problem from spreading. The building sat by itself in an industrial stretch where half the lots were empty and the rest looked dead. No windows, just poured concrete, 2 loading bays, chain link fencing, and security lights so bright they flattened the snow into a white sheet. My paperwork said biological specimens for research, destination a lab in the UP, and the supervisor said the same thing twice in the same calm voice. Keep the trailer at exactly 38 degrees, and if anything changes, call the number on the card. He gave me a laminated card with a phone number printed in black block text, and I slid it above my visor without really looking at it. That should have been the end of it. I should have checked my lights, signed the manifest, and gone north like I had done 100 times before. But when I walked the length of the trailer for my pre-trip, the smell got stronger near the rear doors, sweet and spoiled, and in one hard breath I was back at my grandfather's hunting cabin with the power out and the chest freezer sweating in the dark. Sealed loads always paid better, and I liked the lie they offered, that if I did not look behind the doors, none of what was in there belonged to me. I hooked up anyway. The first part of the drive was ordinary in the way February in Michigan can be ordinary, which is to say gray, salt-streaked, and empty in stretches that make you feel as if the state has been hollowed out. I passed Bay City, let the CB mutter at me about slick patches and way stations, and settled into that trucker numbness where the road becomes a strip of math. Driving had always helped with my head because miles are honest. They do not care what kind of man you are as long as you keep moving. When I turned onto Route 2 and the woods began to crowd the shoulders, the sky was already fading to that bruised color winter gets right before dark. The first thump came an hour later. It was heavy enough to vibrate through the frame, but not heavy enough to feel impossible. And I told myself it was a shift in the load or a pallet strap giving way. Then it happened again, harder this time. And a third hit followed too close behind it, like something was not falling, but correcting itself. I looked at the reefer monitor they had synced to my dash, and the number held steady at 38, clean and perfect, like it had been painted there. I reached for the phone card, tried the number, and got nothing but dead silence because there was no signal out there, and almost no other light but my own. I decided I would stop at the next rest area and use whatever passed for a phone if they had one. The deeper I got into those woods, the more the road felt pinched and airless, like the trees were leaning in to listen. The thumps changed while I drove. They stopped sounding like cargo settling and started sounding like impacts placed with intention. One side, then the other, then a scrape running the length of the trailer wall. The rest area was barely more than a gravel turnout with an outhouse, 2 picnic tables, and a weak lamp over a map board. A couple of cars were parked near the front, but I took the far end and shut the engine off so I could hear clearly. The cold hit me first, then the smell, and now there was something in it besides rot. Wet fur, old ammonia, the sour rankness of something that had lived too close to its own waste. I walked along the driver's side with my flashlight, and for 1 second, everything was still enough that I could hear snow ticking off the undercarriage. Then the scratching started. It came from more than one place at once, high and low, long dragging pulls across metal that had rhythm to them. That was the moment it stopped sounding like freight. I stood with my gloved hand on the trailer skin and heard a clicking noise inside, quick and dry, and underneath that, a thin sound that could have been whining if I had heard it from farther away. When I put my ear near the wall, the The movement inside shifted too, not away from me, but along with me, as if whatever was making those sounds had worked out where I was standing. I backed off and started toward the cab. The scratching cut out so abruptly it felt staged, like silence had been waiting for its cue. The woods went flat around me, just wind in the trees and the metal ping of my own cooling engine. But the smell was no longer pinned to the trailer. It had spread into the dark around me, thin and complete, as if the air itself had gone bad. I turned in a slow circle with the flashlight. Snowbanks, black tree trunks, my own truck 50 feet away, nothing moving anywhere it should not have been. Then something behind me made a sound too deep to belong to any animal I knew. Not a growl and not a roar, more like a chest full of rusted hinges trying to open at once. I ran the rest of the way to the cab, slammed the door, and locked it so hard the handle rattled in my hand while I jammed the truck into gear and pulled back onto Route 2 without looking in the mirrors. The windows were up, the vents were closed, and within 5 miles, the smell was in the cab with me. I kept one hand on the wheel and wiped the fog from the passenger window with my sleeve, thinking maybe I was getting sick, maybe the odor was trapped in my clothes. What came clear under my hand was not my reflection. It was 4 wet tracks running down the inside of the glass from near the top, evenly spaced, as if something with narrow fingers had tested the window and then let go. The card above my visor swung once on its own, and I understood with a kind of slow nausea that whatever had been behind me at the rest stop had not stayed behind me. I spent the next few miles trying to explain those marks to myself, because that was easier than turning my head. Condensation, I thought. A bad wipe pattern, something from a dirty glove. But my hand was too wide, and the trails on the glass were too straight, and every few seconds I could hear a small clicking sound from somewhere behind the sleeper curtain that did not match the engine, the tires, or anything mechanical I knew. I checked the clock when I passed a sign for a county road I recognized. It was 6:12. A minute later, maybe less, I looked down again because the smell had sharpened so suddenly it made my eyes water, and the dash said 6:49. I remember that number because it was so stupidly specific that my brain rejected it at first, like the truck itself was making a joke I was too tired to understand. The road started folding in on itself after that. I passed the same torn snowmobile billboard twice, or 2 billboards that had torn in exactly the same shape, and the mile markers seemed to lag and then jump as if distance had gone soft. Through it all, the reefer readout held at 38 without flicker, without drift, without even the tiny fluctuations you expect from any real machine. I became aware, gradually and horribly, that I was driving with my right shoulder pulled forward because some part of me had decided not to give the passenger side of the cab any room. By the time I reached the next rest area, I was close to throwing up. It was bigger than the first one, brighter too, with 3 other trucks parked near the far row and overhead lights throwing sharp halos onto the asphalt. I pulled in close to the others because I wanted people around me, wanted their engines and voices and cigarettes and normal human carelessness. The second I stepped out, I saw the dark liquid creeping from under the trailer doors. It looked black from a distance, but my flashlight cut red through it when I bent closer. Not bright red, not movie red, just a thick, dark seep that kept catching the light in places and then swallowing it again. I made it to the edge of the lot before I got sick. When I came back wiping my mouth with my sleeve, an older driver in a wool cap was standing by the trailer with his hands on his hips, staring at the ground like it had insulted him. He asked if I knew what I was hauling, and I told him the truth, which somehow sounded worse out loud than it had in my own head. Sealed load, research specimens, 6-hour run. He took one look at my face and handed me a satellite phone from his cab without another question. The dispatcher at State Police listened to me for maybe 20 seconds before she cut in and told me not to open the trailer, not to approach it again, and to stay where other people could see me until units arrived. Then she asked me something I still think about. She asked if anything had entered the cab. I looked back at the truck so fast I felt a pull in my neck. Before I could answer, the older driver frowned toward my windshield and said he had assumed I was traveling with someone because he had seen movement in the passenger seat when I pulled in. He said it casually, the way people say things they think will be corrected in the next sentence, but there was no next sentence in me. The reefer unit gave a low mechanical hum behind us, and for one impossible second, it sounded less like a motor and more like breathing through a blocked nose. The waiting was worse than the drive. Under the overhead lights, that dark fluid did not spread the way spilled liquid should have. It found seams in the pavement, curled around salt, and drew itself in a slow, shallow line toward the passenger side of my tractor, as if it already knew where it was going. I told myself I was watching badly because I was tired and cold and sick from the smell. Then my phone, which had no signal bars at all, lit up with the number from the card above my visor. I did not answer it. State police came first, then a county unit, then a hazmat truck with a clean white trailer, and men who moved with the caution of people who had been warned properly. They put me well back from my own rig and asked for my license, logs, route history, the card, the paperwork. What bothered me was that before anybody touched the trailer doors, one of the hazmat techs climbed into my cab and stayed there almost 10 minutes with a flashlight. When the detective came over after that, he did not ask me what I had heard first. He asked me why I had spent 43 minutes at the earlier rest area. I told him that was wrong. I had been out there maybe 4 minutes, 5 at the absolute most, just long enough to hear the scratching and run back. He showed me the GPS pings on his tablet. The same little blue line paused in one place while the sky around us went black. And then he asked why the passenger door had opened during that stop when I had told him I never opened it at all. When I said it had not, his face did not change. He only glanced at my truck with a look I can still picture too clearly. The look you give a room after somebody says there is one more person in it than there should be. They also had the trailer's temperature log. At 5:17, while I was supposedly at that first rest area, the set point had been changed from 38 to 42 for 7 minutes, and then changed back. I told them nobody but me had access to that control, and I had never touched it. The detective held my eyes through the whole explanation, and then asked me, very softly, if I was sure I had been alone from Flint onward. It is hard to describe what that did to me. Fear is one thing. Having your own memories start to look staged is something uglier. When they finally opened the trailer, I was far enough away that the details should have blurred, and somehow that made it worse. The doors swung wide on a bloom of cold vapor and revealed shapes under white sheeting and clear plastic, large bodies arranged too neatly, as if someone had tried to make order out of a slaughterhouse and failed halfway through. The interior walls were scored with fresh, pale scratches from floor to ceiling, and one corner near the front was almost bare except for bent metal around an air vent and a spread of marks across the ceiling too high for any tied-down animal to make. One of the hazmat men backed away so fast he nearly fell. The detective told me later that night that the load appeared to be illegal animal remains, and that the company who hired me was likely part of a trafficking operation. He kept his words dry and official, but he would not look at me when he said them. Before they released me, he handed back the laminated phone card. He said they found it under my passenger seat, though I had wedged it above the visor myself and never taken it down. When I climbed into the cab to get my coat and duffel, the passenger seatbelt was pulled all the way out and locked across the seat, stretched tight as wire, and the buckle tongue was slick with something that smelled exactly like the inside of that trailer. I quit that company the next morning and never got paid for the run. 2 weeks later, the office number was disconnected. The warehouse outside Flint was empty, and the name on my paperwork led nowhere that stayed still long enough to hold on to. I took local work after that, dry van only, no reefers, no sealed loads, and told people it was because I wanted steadier hours. The truth was that I had started waking at 3:38 every morning with a taste of metal in my mouth and that same spoiled sweetness in the room. And twice in the first month, the dead number from the card called my phone while it was turned off on the kitchen counter. For a while, I tried to let the official story stand, because official stories are easier to live with. Illegal wildlife transport, improper refrigeration, a company cutting corners until something leaked. Then, the detective called me from a blocked number and told me, off the record, that if I wanted to sleep at all, I should stop asking for copies of reports I was not meant to have. That warning did the opposite of what he intended. People only get careful around paperwork when the paperwork says something human beings are built to reject. I got enough through a records request and a friend of a friend to understand one thing clearly. 38 degrees was not a storage instruction. It was a control point. One internal memo recovered from the warehouse said activity decreased significantly between 37 and 39 and became difficult to predict above 40. That line was buried in a packet full of veterinary language and chemical abbreviations, but it sat in my head like a nail because it turned the whole trip inside out. They had not been trying to keep the load cold enough to preserve it. They had been trying to keep something in it slow. The rest came in pieces. The trailer held 11 tagged carcasses from different animals, some wild, some domestic, all badly mishandled, all mixed with sedatives that should not have been in a legal shipment. There were 12 injection sites recorded in the preliminary notes, and only 11 bodies counted. The rear seal had never been broken. The fresh scratches on the interior walls contained trace material that matched blood from several species and tissue from none they could identify with certainty, which sounds ridiculous until you read it in a government font and realize nobody was joking. That should have felt like the answer. Instead, it sharpened the part I could not put down, which was my own part in it. I had heard something alive back there before the first rest stop, maybe before I even left Flint, and I had kept driving because the pay was good and the route was familiar, and men in uniforms had told me not to ask questions. That was the lie sealed loads sell you, the same lie I had been buying since I was old enough to follow directions from older men with hard voices. If you do not open the door, you tell yourself, what is behind it is not yours. But it becomes yours the second you choose the road over the truth. The memory from my grandfather's cabin came back all at once one night in March while I was brushing my teeth. Not the version I had carried for years about spoiled venison and a dead freezer, the real one. I was 14, the power had gone out, and my grandfather had sent me to the shed for lamp oil when I heard scratching under the lid of the chest freezer. Slow at first, and then violent enough to shake frost loose from the hinges. When I stepped closer, I saw 4 wet lines appear under the white glaze on the lid from the inside, as if something there had pressed up and dragged downward. My grandfather came through the door so fast he slammed me into the wall with his shoulder, then stood over the freezer with both hands on it, breathing hard, and told me to get the lantern and not say a word to my mother. The next morning, the shed smelled exactly like my trailer had smelled outside Flint. By spring, the shed had burned, and for 20 years, I let myself believe that was the beginning and end of it. I do not know if my grandfather was involved with the same people or only tangled with the same kind of thing. I found an old invoice in a coffee can of his after he died, and the address at the top was an industrial lot in Flint, the same district as that bunker warehouse, though the company name had changed twice by the time it got to me. That is enough connection for my mind, maybe too much. The detective never returned my calls after I told him about the cabin. 3 days later, the blocked number tried me again, but when I answered, all I heard was breathing and a thin click against metal, spaced out and patient. I had the phone company trace the number on the laminated card. They told me it had been inactive for years. That should have settled it. But dead things have a way of refusing the paperwork written about them. The number still appears on my screen in dead zones where no signal should exist. And once, driving west at dusk, I saw it for less than a second in the reflection of my windshield, bright as a road sign, before the glass clouded over from the inside. My cab temperature dropped so fast my knuckles ached, And when I looked down, the trailer monitor in a truck hauling paper towels read 38, though I knew for a fact there was no reefer behind me. These days I drive dry vans and refuse every sealed load they offer, even if the money would fix things for a month. Some nights on Route 2, especially in February, the passenger side of the cab settles a little lower without explanation, and the seatbelt clicks out one notch at a time, like a hand testing it. I keep my eyes on the windshield because I know now what grows in the dark around obedience, around shame, around the relief of not looking too closely. The smell reaches me before the trailer does now, and there is no trailer anymore. If a woman cries for help on Channel 19 between Russellville and Fort Smith, keep driving. I answered once, and before the night was over, the voice on that radio knew my daughter's name, the cheap pine smell inside my cab, and how close I was to falling asleep. I have been driving big rigs for nearly 15 years, and I used to think the road was dangerous in ordinary ways. Weather, tires, men with more speed than sense. I did not understand that loneliness itself could be used like a tool. It was late October, a little after 2 in the morning, and I was eastbound on Interstate 40 with a sealed load of electronics headed for Oklahoma City. That stretch through western Arkansas gets thin at night, like the world has been pared down to black trees, white lane markers, and the pale tunnel of your own headlights. I had been rolling since 6 that morning, and my body had started sending me the small warnings I used to ignore. My eyes burned, my shoulders ached under the seatbelt, and every mile felt padded, soft around the edges. Emily had called me earlier that night, and I had let it go to voicemail because I was making time. She was 22 then, in nursing school, and lately every conversation with her had the same bruise in it. She said I was always halfway somewhere else, even when I was talking to her. On the voicemail, she tried to make it a joke, but I could hear the edge under it. "Call me when you hit Oklahoma," she said. "And if you're getting stupid tired, park it." I kept one of those little pine tree air fresheners hanging from the dash because Emily said my truck smelled like old coffee and wet denim. The scent had long since faded into something dry and chemical, but every time the fan kicked high, it would start swinging and tap lightly against the windshield. Tick, tick, tick. That noise had been with me so long, I usually stopped hearing it after a while. Outside Russellville, I had pulled into a truck stop for fuel and a coffee I did not need as much as I pretended. The night air had a metallic bite to it, but under that, I caught a sweet, dark smell that did not belong there at all. Clove cigarettes, the kind I had not smelled since I was young. A woman stood near the vending machines in a gray knit cap, one shoulder turned toward the fuel island, not really buying anything, not really looking at anyone. I barely gave her a thought. On the road, you train yourself not to stare. The CB mic in that truck had an old problem I kept postponing. The transmit button liked to hang for a second after I took my thumb off it, leaving the channel open just long enough to leak a little of the cab into the world. I knew it. I had known it for months, and every trip I told myself I would swap it out when I got home. I reached up and tapped it once, more out of habit than caution, and the red light on the radio blinked, then went dark. About 40 miles outside Fort Smith, the woman came over Channel 19. She sounded young, not a performance of fear, not at first. She sounded like somebody trying not to lose control and failing anyway, breath snagging in her throat, words collapsing into each other. Her car had died, she said, eastbound shoulder near mile marker 62. Phone dead, hazards on, nobody had stopped for almost an hour. I answered too fast. The minute I heard her, all I could think was that she sounded close enough to Emily's age to make my chest tighten. I told her my company name and asked for the marker again, just to be sure. She repeated it, and relief flooded her voice so quickly it felt almost physical, like hearing a person get pulled up out of water. She thanked me over and over, so grateful it almost embarrassed me, and I told her I would be there in 10 minutes. That is truck life more than people realize. We survive because somebody stops. As I got close, I eased off the throttle and started scanning the shoulder for hazard lights. I found them a quarter mile ahead, bright and steady in the dark, a small car sitting on the right shoulder as neat as a picture. I rolled up behind it with my flashers on and set enough distance for traffic to see both of us. Then I noticed the first thing that did not fit. The car was too straight, too cleanly placed, not limped there in panic but parked there on purpose. I stayed in the cab with the engine idling and looked harder. No steam from the hood, no one moving inside. The hazards were almost painfully bright, like fresh bulbs, and the woods beyond the shoulder looked thicker than they should have, a wall of trunks swallowing my headlights before they could settle on anything. The pine tree ticked against the glass. I picked up the mic and said, "I'm the truck behind you. You okay, miss?" Her answer came back right away, but the crying was gone. "Yes," she said, and there was something eager in it now, something reaching. "Can you come up to the car? I think it's the engine belt." Nobody stranded alone at 2 a.m. talks like that. I was still staring at the car when I caught movement in the trees to the right, one shape, then another, then a third shifting low between the trunks. Before I could move, the radio clicked and her voice came back cold and flat. "Come on up here, driver, and fix that little pine tree before it drives you crazy." I did not think my way out of that shoulder. My body moved before my mind caught up, left foot down, right hand shoving the gear into place, the truck lunging forward with that heavy, delayed violence only a loaded rig has. In the mirrors, I saw them break from the tree line at last. 2 men, and maybe a third shape behind them, all of them running for the road, too late. The little car stayed perfectly still. That was the worst part. It had been waiting better than any human body can wait. The CB exploded with noise as I pulled back onto the interstate. First the woman again, laughing now in little clipped pieces, then a man's voice so angry it sounded raw around the edges. He called me every name you can imagine, but buried in it was one sentence that did the real damage. "Tell Emily her old man nearly stopped." I switched channels so hard I almost tore the knob off. My hands were slipping on it. On 17, another driver answered almost immediately, an older guy running westbound who called himself Maverick. His voice had the solid, unhurried tone men get after enough years on the road, and I clung to it harder than I want to admit. I told him what I had seen, where it was, what kind of car, how many shapes in the trees. He said he was calling Arkansas State Police right then and told me to keep rolling, not to stop for anybody, not even a uniform unless I could verify it. That should have calmed me. It did not. Mile markers passed in a way that felt wrong after that, too slowly, and then all at once. I kept checking the mirrors, expecting headlights to peel out of the dark behind me, expecting that little car to show up in the left lane with somebody standing on the shoulder of it and smiling. Nothing came. The road stayed almost empty, just the low drone of tires and the cold air blowing from the vent across my wrists. Even so, it felt crowded inside the cab, like I had carried something away from that shoulder and it had taken the passenger seat. I met the troopers at the Flying J outside Fort Smith, and the fluorescent light in that place made everything look skinned. They took my statement at a plastic table near the coffee station, while truckers came and went around us, paying for fuel, buying sandwiches, living inside the ordinary world as if I had not just driven out of something arranged for me in the dark. One of the troopers was young and keyed up, still running on adrenaline. The older one had the blank, careful face of a man who had already decided how much he would say. He told me this was not the first fake breakdown on that stretch. 3 incidents in 6 months, all built around a stranded vehicle and a call for help on CB. One driver had been beaten and robbed. One had done what I did and escaped. And one from Missouri had disappeared completely after stopping near mile marker 58. His truck had been found abandoned. He had not. Then the older trooper slid one more detail across the table in a voice so flat it almost missed me. They had found clove cigarette butts in the woods at 62, fresh enough to still carry the smell. I saw the woman at Russellville again the instant he said it. Gray cap, vending machine light on one cheek, standing where she could hear the fuel island and the chatter drifting out of open cab doors. The trooper asked whether my radio ever stuck open when I was transmitting. I looked at him, then at the mic still clipped to my dash, and for a second, I could not answer. He said crews like this sometimes profiled drivers before they ever set the trap. They listened for names, routes, how tired a man sounded, whether he talked about family. That was the part that hollowed me out. I kept remembering Emily's voicemail playing through the cab while I checked my route. I remembered muttering back at nobody, saying her name out loud, promising I would call when I crossed into Oklahoma. I remembered the little pine tree tapping the windshield while I fueled up, and the old mic taking that extra half second to release. Not much, just enough. Just enough to let strangers build a hand that fit the inside of my life. I finished the run because freight does not care what almost happened to you. But the night had lodged in me by then. Every burst of static started sounding human. I would hear crying under the hiss of the tires, hear breath in the pause before a driver answered, hear that eager little shift in tone right before fear turns into appetite. More than once, I reached for the volume knob and found my hand shaking so badly I missed it. Sleep did not help. In sleep, I was always parked on that shoulder and listening for footsteps in the leaves. I changed how I drove after that. I started calling state police first for any roadside plea, no exceptions, and I installed cameras facing front and rear, plus a recorder tied into the CB. 6 months later, Arkansas State Police called to say the incidents had stopped, and they suspected the crew had either moved on or been picked up on something else. I wanted that to feel like an ending. Instead, it felt like the sort of silence you get when a line goes dead and you are still holding the receiver to your ear. The first time I took that route again with the new equipment, I crossed into the old stretch just after 2 in the morning without meaning to. I had even thrown the pine tree freshener away by then, sick of looking at it, sick of what it had become. But when I passed the sign for mile marker 62, the cab filled with that same dry evergreen smell, so suddenly it was like biting into aspirin. Then channel 19 clicked. A young woman, soft as if she were leaning in close, said, "You still let it tap the glass, driver?" I did not answer. I kept both hands on the wheel and drove straight through the dark, every muscle in my back locked so tight it hurt to breathe. At the next truck stop, I pulled the memory card from the recorder and played the file alone in the sleeper with the curtains drawn. On the live transmission, her voice had come over the CB speaker. On the recording, it was there too. But under it, just beneath the static, was a second sound the road noise had hidden from me. Tick, tick, tick. Something small and plastic, touching glass from inside the cab where nothing was hanging anymore. A few weeks after that, the older trooper called me back. His voice had changed. It had the tired caution people use when they are about to tell you something that should make you feel better, and no, it will not. A crew had been picked up in eastern Oklahoma on burglary charges, and among the junk in one storage unit, they found CB equipment, scanners, and a digital recorder full of traffic from truck routes across Arkansas and Oklahoma. He asked if I would come in and listen. I sat in a county office with headphones on and heard pieces of myself I did not know I had given away. There was the fuel island undercurrent from Russellville, diesel engines idling, a receipt printer chirping, somebody dragging a squeegee across glass. Then my own cab leaked into the recording through that bad transmit button I had neglected one trip too many. Emily's voicemail came through thin and tinny, followed by my voice answering nobody, tired and ashamed, saying, "I know, Em, I know." In the background, faint as an insect, was the little pine tree tapping the windshield. The next file was worse. A woman's voice, calm, not frightened, not yet performing, repeated bits of what she had just heard from my truck until she got the rhythm right. "Phone dead. I've been out here almost an hour. Please, somebody help me." Off to one side, a man coached her in a near whisper, telling her to sound younger, shakier, more grateful. Then another man said, "He's got a daughter. Push that. I sat there with those headphones digging into my ears and understood something ugly all the way down. They had not just set a trap on the shoulder, they had climbed into my cab first and made the trap out of me. They could explain most of it after that. The clove smell, the woman at the truck stop, the way the voice shifted from desperate to eager once I was in position. They could even explain how the man on the radio knew Emily's name, because I had said it out loud where the channel could carry it. That was the coherent part, the part a report can hold. But the older trooper did not have a report for the second recording, the one from months later with the tapping under it. He listened to that file twice, took off the headphones, and told me maybe some damage does not stay where it happened. That night I called Emily and told her more than I had planned to. Not every detail, not the parts that would keep her awake, but enough for her to understand why my voice had gone hard anytime anybody mentioned roadside trouble. She listened in a silence that felt older than she was. Then she said, very carefully, "Dad, if I ever call you scared, don't make me prove it's me." I wanted to tell her I never would. What came out instead was the truth. I said, "I'm trying not to become that man." A month later, she actually did call me from the side of a county road outside Tulsa with a blown tire and no spare. She was crying and angry and cold, and the first thing my mind did was split the sound apart, looking for seams in it, looking for rehearsal, listening for anybody breathing behind her. I hated myself so fast it made me sick. I stayed on the line until I reached her, and she never mentioned the delay in my answer, but I heard it anyway for weeks afterward. That was what those people had really taken. Not my money, not cargo. They had gotten their hands around the reflex that makes you trust fear when you hear it. I still call the police first. I still do what a careful man is supposed to do. But there is no clean way to live after a thing like that, because caution has a body count too, and you rarely get to see it. Once in New Mexico, a girl came over 19 saying she had spun out near an exit and could not get her car started. I called it in, gave the marker, kept moving, and stared at my mirrors for 20 miles. No officer ever called back for more information, and no report ever surfaced that I could find. Maybe it was another setup, maybe it was not. That uncertainty settles into a man like silt. Every October, when my route puts me through western Arkansas after midnight, I tell myself I am past the worst of it. The road looks ordinary. The signs are the same faded green. The woods the same black wall pressing up against the shoulder. The truck stops lit the same tired yellow. Then, somewhere between Russellville and Fort Smith, I catch the ghost of Clove in the vents, or I hear that faint, dry tapping from the passenger side of the windshield, and my hands tighten on the wheel before I can stop them. I threw that air freshener away years ago. I watched it land in a gas station trash can under a layer of coffee cups and lottery tickets. Still, some nights, it comes back. Last October, I made that run with the CB powered off, not turned down, off. I did it on purpose because I wanted one clean pass through that mile marker, one stretch of dark where no voice could reach me unless it came from a place I was not prepared to name. The truck moved steady under me, the dash dim, the woods on the right holding their own depthless silence. Just past 62, with the radio dead and the mic unplugged in the cup holder, a young woman said, very gently, "Thank you for stopping." I did not stop. I did not look at the shoulder, and I did not look into the trees. I drove all the way into Oklahoma with the heater running too high and both palms welded to the wheel, listening to nothing but tires and my own breath and that tiny imagined tick against the glass. So if a woman cries for help on Channel 19 between Russellville and Fort Smith, keep driving. The part I cannot say out loud is this: now I keep driving even when the radio is dead, and some nights she thanks me before I have decided what kind of man I am. The first wrong thing was that the woman in my passenger seat did not smell like rain. In a storm that had turned Highway 287 into a black river, she carried the dry scent of motel soap and old paper, like she had stepped out of a closed room instead of the Texas shoulder. My name is Maria, and I had been driving a truck for 8 years when I picked her up south of Childress with a load of farm equipment and thunder crawling over the panhandle. By the time she shut my passenger door, the cab already felt smaller than it should have. Any other night, I would have kept going. Company policy said no riders, and common sense said the same thing louder. But the year before, my daughter Ellie died during a storm on a county road outside Vernon, and the last thing she left me was a voicemail full of windshield wipers and a voice trying not to sound scared. Ever since then, a woman stranded in bad weather does not look like a stranger to me. She looks like a debt. Ellie had left a yellow scrunchie looped around my gear shift the last weekend she rode with me, and I never took it off. The passenger seat had its own quirk, too. If anything heavier than a lunch bag sat there without the belt clicked, the truck gave a sharp 2-note ding until I fixed it. And behind my seat, I kept a white hand towel with blue stitched initials on one corner, the kind of motel freebie drivers keep for spills and wet hands and all the little messes a long road makes. None of that meant anything then. By 7 that evening, the sky had come all the way down. Rain slapped the windshield so hard the wipers looked useless, just 2 black arms panicking across glass. The trailer kept nudging sideways under the wind, and every lightning strike turned the fields white for half a second, flat and empty and wrong. I was hunting for a safe place to pull over when my headlights found her. She was standing on the shoulder with her thumb out, shirt pasted to her skin, hair blown across her mouth, maybe 100 yards ahead of me. She looked small enough to disappear in the weather, but there was something in the way she faced the road that made me hit the brakes instead of the gas. Not hope, not relief. It looked more like she had already seen what happened if I did not stop. I rolled down the passenger window an inch, and rain blew straight into my face. She ran up to the cab and shouted that her car had died 5 miles back, that she had been walking for over an hour, that she only needed a ride to the next town. Up close, she looked to be in her 30s, pale, shaking. No bag, no coat, no visible weapon, just jeans and a t-shirt soaked dark from collar to hem. "Get in," I told her, hearing my own voice like it belonged to a softer woman. She climbed up fast and sat down hard enough to wake the seat sensor. The cab gave its 2 bright warning notes, and before I could reach over, the sound stopped. I handed her the white towel and told her to dry off while I turned the heat up, but when she pressed the cloth to her hair and cheeks, it barely darkened at all. She thanked me and said her name was Linda, and when she smiled, it seemed practiced, like she was putting a face on after forgetting to wear one. Then she started looking at me instead of the road. Not quick glances, long, patient studies, the kind a person gives a photograph when they are checking whether it matches the memory in their head. When I asked where her car was, she said, "Back there," but did not point. And when I asked what kind of car it was, she waited a beat too long before saying, "A Chevy." Outside, the storm kept hitting the truck in pulses that felt deliberate, as if something large was pacing us in the dark. A few miles later, she began asking questions that had nothing to do with getting warm or getting safe. How long had I been driving? If I usually ran alone? Whether I was married? If I had children? Where I slept when I was off the road? Her tone stayed soft, but the questions moved through the cab like fingers opening drawers. I told her I needed to focus on the highway, and she smiled at the windshield instead of answering me. Then the cab chimed again. 2 neat notes, bright and cheerful, right beside her. I glanced over and saw the seatbelt was already clicked across her lap. Linda did not even look down. She just reached out and touched the yellow scrunchie on my gear shift with the backs of her fingers, almost tender, and said, "You still keep it where she left it." I asked her what she meant, and she turned toward me slowly enough that I heard the leather of the seat sigh under her. Lightning filled the cab, blue and flat, and for that instant, her face looked less wet than polished. She said, very softly, "Rain's coming under the door, Mom." Those were the first words from Ellie's last voicemail, and I had never played that message for anyone. For a second, I thought maybe I had spoken out loud without meaning to, that grief had leaked through my teeth and she had simply borrowed it back. But my mouth was dry, my hands were locked on the wheel, and the woman beside me was watching my face with the calm interest of someone checking a trap after hearing it spring. I asked her who told her that. She said, "You did, eventually," and reached into her pocket. The phone she pulled out was completely dry. Not water-resistant dry, not protected in a plastic bag dry. It looked like it had come off a nightstand 10 seconds earlier. Screen clean, edges clean, not a bead of storm on it anywhere. She tipped it just enough for the light to hit her face, and for one moment, I saw what was on the screen before she angled it away from me. It was Ellie. Not a video, not a live call, a screenshot from my memorial page, the one I had left up and never found the nerve to delete, with Ellie sitting in the passenger seat of this exact truck and the yellow scrunchie looped around the shifter between us. Linda had not recognized the scrunchie from some ghostly instinct. She had seen the picture before she ever stepped onto that shoulder. My stomach tightened, but it did not settle anything. The photo explained the name. It did not explain the line from the voicemail. It did not explain why the towel in her hands still looked folded, or why the cab kept holding that dry, shut-in smell, as though all the rain outside had been stopped by an invisible wall at her skin. She lifted the phone to her ear and spoke so low I only caught fragments. "Got one," she said. 20 out. Then, after listening a moment, "Agricultural equipment." She ended the call and tucked the phone away with the same small, careful motion a woman might use putting lipstick back in her purse. "Change of plans," she said. "You are taking the next exit north." The green sign for the exit appeared ahead through the rain, then disappeared behind a curtain of water. A minute later, it was there again at the same distance, bright and floating, as if the road had folded and set it back in front of us. I checked the dashboard clock. It still read 7:19. I looked at the mile marker on the shoulder and felt the skin pull tight across my shoulders. I had passed mile marker 212 twice. Linda must have seen me look because she smiled without showing her teeth. "It gets slippery through here," she said. "Easy to miss where you are." Then she slipped her free hand into her pocket and brought out a folding knife, keeping it low against her leg where I could still see the metal catch the dash light. "Take the north exit, Maria. Do not make this harder than it already is." The cab shrank around that blade. The heater hummed. Rain hammered the roof in waves. Somewhere inside the engine noise and the wiper drag, my daughter's voicemail had started replaying in my head, but not the way memory usually works. It was as if I was hearing it from the next room, while someone else stood between me and the door. I said I was not getting off the highway. She answered with a little shrug, the kind people use when a fact has already been settled. "That is where she waited too," she said, and nodded toward the coming exit. I did not ask who she meant, because every part of me already knew. My hands were sweating so badly on the wheel that the leather felt soft. Then I looked down at the floor mat under her boots. There should have been mud. There should have been dirty water running off the cuffs of her jeans, grit and weeds and panhandle shoulder packed into the ridges of my rubber mat. There was nothing there. The only wet thing in the passenger side of that cab was me. My trainer had told me once that if a bad situation blooms inside a truck, you use the truck. You use the weight, the surprise, the fact that most people think a cab is a room when it is really a moving machine with moods of its own. I began easing off the gas like I was cooperating, letting the nose drift toward the exit lane. Linda relaxed just enough for me to see it happen in her throat. "Good," she said. "You are learning." I cut the wheel hard before the ramp. The truck dropped off the pavement into the median with a violence that ripped a sound out of both of us. A deep metal shudder followed by the hammering slam of the trailer taking the rut behind me. Linda hit the passenger door shoulder first. The knife flew loose. The world went sideways, then mud, then brakes, then silence so sudden it made the rain sound farther away than it was. I was out of my door before the truck fully settled. Rain hit me like thrown gravel and soaked me in one breath. I ran around, yanked her door open, and found Linda sprawled half across the floor, one hand searching blindly for the knife. I grabbed her wrist, dragged her down out of the cab, and she came screaming into the mud with a force that nearly took me with her. Up close, in the lightning, her face changed faster than faces should. Not into something monstrous. That would have been easier. For a single white blink, she looked young, frightened, mouth trembling in the exact shape Ellie's had when she used to wake from bad dreams and pretend she had not been crying. "Do not answer too late this time, Mom," she said, and I let go of her like I had touched a hot wire. I climbed back into the truck and locked both doors with shaking hands. Linda was on her feet in the median, pounding on the passenger side, rain running off her hair in silver ropes, mouth moving wide with words I could not hear through the glass. I jammed the truck into gear and clawed my way back onto the highway. When I looked over once, just once, the shoulder was empty. Then the seatbelt alarm started. 2 bright notes, a pause, 2 more. The passenger seat beside me looked empty, but the cushion was pressed down in the shape of a body. Before I could tell myself it was mud or angle or panic, the speaker over my head crackled and my daughter's voice came out of it, small and close and tired, picking up in the middle of a message I had never once been able to finish listening to. I drove to the next truck stop by instinct more than judgment. The place was all floodlight and diesel sheen and rainwater running black through the lot, and I remember thinking how obscene ordinary things looked under that kind of fear. I called DPS from inside the cab because I could not make my legs work right away. When the trooper arrived, I gave him the clean version first. Female hitchhiker, armed robbery attempt, possible accomplices waiting off the north exit. He listened without interrupting, wrote everything down, and told me there had been 3 similar incidents in that corridor in the past month. Same setup, same bad weather when they could get it, a woman alone on the shoulder, a scared voice, a short ride that turned into a redirect and a threat. One driver had been beaten at a truck stop. One had vanished with his truck. One was still missing. When he asked if I would look at photographs, I said yes before I thought about what that meant. The face I picked out belonged to Rebecca Thornton, not Linda, and there was nothing remarkable about that except how unsurprised I felt. What turned my stomach was the second folder he opened after that, the one with printed screenshots recovered from a phone in a related arrest. Rebecca's crew had been collecting drivers the way hunters collect trail camera images. My memorial page for Ellie was in that folder. The screenshot showed the same picture I had seen on Rebecca's phone, Ellie laughing in my passenger seat with one boot on the edge of the floor mat and the yellow scrunchie hanging between us. There were comments under it from people saying how much she loved riding with me, how storms used to scare her, how she always stole my hair ties and left them in the truck. Rebecca had not guessed where to press. She had studied for it. The trooper kept talking, telling me these crews looked for soft spots, for widowers and single women, and men with family stickers on the back glass. Anyone whose decency could be predicted and used. I nodded when I was supposed to nod. I answered what I could. I did not tell him what Rebecca had said in my cab, because there is a point in every terrible night where facts stop helping and start making you sound unwell. When he finally left me to finish paperwork, I climbed back into my truck and shut the door softly, like I was entering a room where someone might be asleep. The passenger seat was empty. The pressure mark in the cushion was gone, and the white hand towel I had given Rebecca was folded neatly on the seat, blue initials turned upward, dry as laundry. I stared at it for a long time before I touched it. It smelled faintly of motel soap and something older underneath, a stale paper smell, the inside of drawers that have been kept closed too long. I do not know whether the trooper had missed it, whether I had brought it back there without remembering, or whether there are moments when the mind, cornered badly enough, begins setting the stage for its own collapse. I only know the towel had not been there when I made the call. I sat in that truck stop lot until the rain softened, and then I did something I should have done a year earlier. I played the rest of Ellie's voicemail. Her voice came through with road noise behind it, shaky but trying to stay light, trying to protect me from what she needed to say. "Mom, my tire blew. I pulled over by a fence line. Rain's coming under the door. There's a woman out here waving at me like she knows me." There was a few seconds of breathing, then the sound of knuckles tapping glass. "I am keeping the doors locked. Call me when you stop. Mom?" Another pause, a smaller voice. "She just said your name." That was the part I had never heard, either because I had never made myself keep listening, or because something in me had erased it to keep the rest of me standing. Ellie had not died in some blind, pointless weather accident, the way I had forced myself to believe. Something had come to her window first, smiling and soaked and asking to be let in. I wish I could tell you that knowledge gave me peace, or at least shape. It did not. It only moved the pain into a different room. I had not imagined the danger on the road, and I had not failed to recognize it because I was weak. I had recognized it because it already knew my family. I never picked up another hitchhiker after that night. I do not care if the shoulder is full of rain and tears and outstretched hands. I keep my doors locked, my eyes forward, and I tell myself that survival has its own ugly rules. But every June, when the clouds stack low over the panhandle, and Highway 287 starts looking like a strip of film somebody has soaked in black water, the passenger side alarm finds its voice again. 2 bright notes, a pause, 2 more. Sometimes it happens with nothing on the seat at all. Sometimes it happens at mile marker 212, where the exit sign seems to hang a little too long in the rain. And once, after I had finally taken Ellie's yellow scrunchie off the gear shift and stuffed it into the side pocket of my door, I stopped for fuel outside Amarillo and found it looped through the passenger seatbelt latch, damp and cold against my fingers. So now I trust the first wrong thing. I trust the smell before the sight of her, that dry scent of motel soap and old paper sliding into the cab while the storm is still a mile off. I trust the way the empty passenger seat settles, just a little, as if somebody careful has sat down beside me. And when the road goes black and the alarm begins its 2-note warning, I do not look over anymore, because I know the shoulder is not the dangerous place. By then, whatever is waiting has already gotten in. The road to Charleston should have taken 3 hours, but sometime after midnight, my GPS turned me toward a town that had stopped in 1923. What keeps needling at me is that the town's name was already on my freight bill before I ever left Martinsburg, stamped in blue ink so ordinary I barely saw it. I had been hauling through the Appalachians for 9 years by then, long enough to trust my hands more than my nerves, and that November run should have been nothing but furniture, coffee, and wet mountain dark. The code on the bill read MLBK, tucked beside the load number, and I remember thinking it was just some warehouse shorthand. I keep an old Rand McNally in the passenger door because my father drove West Virginia before I did. One county page in that atlas has been glued together by an ancient coffee spill for as long as I can remember, and I never bothered with it because the interstate made it useless. The dash clock in my Kenworth also ran 4 minutes slow whenever the cold got into the wiring. Another small defect I kept meaning to fix. Those were the kind of details a man lives with on the road. The little harmless things that do not feel like warnings until later. My father disappeared on a winter run when I was 13, and I grew up swearing that if I ever took his seat behind a wheel, I would at least come home when I said I would. By the time this happened, I already had a daughter old enough to notice broken promises and a life that felt more like truck stops than a house. That night, an accident on I-81 backed traffic for miles. Then construction on 64 shoved every rig onto a detour, and I kept watching the minutes burn away. I had told my daughter I would be back by breakfast, which is the kind of promise that sounds small until the clock starts winning. By the time I got near Charleston, fog had come down so hard it looked poured, not fallen. My headlights only reached a few truck lengths before the white swallowed them, and the GPS voice sounded too calm when it told me to take the next right to stay on the fastest route. The digital map still showed a clean blue line, but the arrival time kept jerking around like somebody else's hand was dragging it. 30 minutes became an hour and 15, then 44 minutes, while my dash clock sat stubborn at 11:52. The turn itself was easy to miss. which bothered me because I knew that stretch of road. There was no sign I could read through the fog, just a break in the trees and old blacktop lifting into the mountain like a scar. The minute I eased onto it, the truck changed its voice. The tires started humming over cracked pavement, the trailer shook in potholes, and the dark beyond the shoulder felt wide and unguarded. When I reached for the atlas, the stuck page would not give under my thumb, and for a second, I could smell coal smoke over my own diesel. I told myself there had to be an old county route up there, some forgotten connector my GPS knew and I did not. That explanation lasted maybe 10 minutes. There were no reflectors, no centerline worth trusting, no mailboxes, no porch lights, and not one pair of taillights ahead of me or behind me. In those mountains, even empty roads usually feel like they belong to somebody, but this one felt borrowed. Then I saw lights below the fog. At first, they looked like a truck stop spread out in the valley, but when I crested the hill, the whole place opened under me in a shape that made no sense. It was a town, small and self-contained, with wooden storefronts, narrow houses, and lamps throwing amber halos that trembled in the mist. Nothing about it matched the century I had left an hour earlier. I drove down the main street at idle, hearing my diesel rattle off brick and wood as if the buildings were listening. Men in suspenders crossed under the lamps, women in long coats stepped out of shops, and a wagon sat beside a car with round fenders and thin tires that belonged in old photographs. Nobody screamed or ran. They looked at my truck the way people look at a storm they cannot stop and have already decided to survive. The gas station stood on the corner with 2 glass-top pumps and a tin sign advertising gasoline for 12 cents a gallon. A man in overalls came out wiping his hands on a rag, and when he tipped his cap back to study my cab, there was curiosity in his face, but no surprise. He asked me what kind of engine could move a machine that size, and when I told him diesel, the word landed in the air between us like I had made it up. I asked him what town I was in and how to get back to Interstate 64. He squinted toward the fog as if I had asked for an ocean. "This is Millbrook," he said, slow and certain. Then he looked at me the way people do when they think sickness might be walking around inside your skin, and he said, "And the year is 1923, mister. You ought to sit down if you were feeling wrong." I looked at the freight bill on the seat beside me, at the blue stamp that read MLBK, and the inside of the cab seemed to tilt a few degrees off level. I got back into my truck so fast I banged my knee on the steering column and barely felt it. All I wanted was the hill behind me, the bad road, the fog, anything that still belonged to the world I understood. But when I turned around, people were already standing across the street, shoulder to shoulder, not packed tight, just placed there with a patient kind of certainty. Their faces held the same look I had seen on families waiting outside hospital rooms. An older man in a black suit stepped out from among them and came to my window. His clothes were plain and almost formal, but they sat on him wrong, as if he had been wearing that same suit for years longer than cloth should last. He rested one hand on the door and said, very quietly, "You do not belong here." Then his eyes dropped to the passenger door and the atlas wedged there, and he added, "I knew a man once who carried that road book." I had never said a word about my father, and I had not given anybody my name. The old man studied me with a kind of tired pity and said the roads take what is loose first. Minutes, names, promises, all the things a person tells himself he can spare. He said men who live between truck stops and kitchen tables are easy for those roads to feel opening under their tires. Then he told me my daughter was asleep on a chair by the window, still dressed for school, because she had believed I meant breakfast. He gave me 2 choices in the same gentle voice. I could stay in Millbrook, let the road close behind me, take work, take a room, and become part of a place that would never ask me to make another promise to the living. Or I could take the far road out of town, the one that crossed into places where time thinned out so badly a man could lose the order of his own life. When I put the truck in gear and headed for the far end of the street, the crowd did not move to stop me. They watched me go with the hurt expression of people being left twice. Past the last house, the road bent into heavier fog and the lamps of Millbrook sank behind me one by one. The pavement changed every few miles beneath the tires, from broken tar to packed dirt to something smooth and pale that reflected no light back at all. I passed a frontier street with hitching posts and lanterns, then a row of bungalows under chrome diner signs, then a church lit by electric bulbs buzzing over cars from the 50s. Every place seemed prepared for me. Every place seemed to expect that eventually I would stop. That was when my own memory began to come apart at the seams. I tried to picture my daughter's face and got the color of her raincoat before I got her eyes, which felt so wrong it made my hands go numb on the wheel. My logbook showed times I did not remember writing, neat entries in my own pen that listed roads I had never heard of. On the CB, voices bled in and out through static, some clipped and modern, some slow and old, and one of them used the exact phrase my father used to say every winter: "Keep it between the ditches." The trailer started sounding wrong, too. New furniture should shift in dull, heavy thumps, but what I heard behind me was lighter than that, sharper, like chair legs setting down on wood floors and cabinet doors trying their hinges. Once, over a bad dip, I heard something that sounded like silverware settling in a drawer. The smell in the cab changed from wet diesel and coffee to beeswax, old varnish, and the faint sweetness of apples left too long in a cellar. I began to feel less like I was hauling a load through the mountains and more like I was dragging pieces of a house toward a place that had been waiting for them. I stopped only once, at a narrow bridge where the guardrails disappeared into fog so thick it looked solid enough to lean against. When I opened the door, the air outside was warmer than the cab and carried a low murmur from below. Not water, not wind, but voices layered over each other as if years were talking all at once under the boards. I got back in without looking over the edge. As I pulled away, I glanced at the passenger seat and saw the cushion pressed inward, just for a second, with the shape of someone sitting there. The worst place was a little roadside row of houses painted in colors too cheerful for the dark. On one porch, under a yellow bulb, a girl stood in a raincoat the same color my daughter wore when she was 8, the year I missed her school play because a load out of Roanoke ran late. She did not wave. She only lifted her chin and mouthed, clear as if she were in the cab with me, "You promised." I pressed the accelerator so hard my calf cramped. At some point, the fog thinned, and green highway signs rose ahead like something remembered instead of seen. Interstate 64, Charleston. The letters shook in my vision because my whole body had started trembling, not with relief exactly, but with the effort of staying myself long enough to reach the ramp. As I merged onto the interstate, the dash clock jumped once and settled on 11:52 again, and through a burst of static on the CB, I heard the old man's voice say, almost tenderly, 4 minutes is enough to lose a life. I made it to the first truck stop west of town and sat under the fluorescent canopy until another driver knocked on my window to ask if I was sick. My dispatcher had been calling for hours, and when I finally answered, his voice had that flatness people get when panic has already spent itself. According to the company tracker, my rig had vanished into a patch of mountain where there were no drivable roads and stayed there for more than 12 hours. Search crews had been getting ready to look over embankments. They found nothing wrong with me at the clinic except high blood pressure and the smell of smoke in my clothes that nobody could place. I went home after sunrise, and my daughter was asleep at the kitchen table with her backpack still on, her cheek against a math worksheet and a plate beside her that had gone dry around 2 pieces of toast. Seeing that hit me harder than Millbrook did. For one clean second, I understood what it might have looked like when my father failed to come back. And I hated that understanding because it felt too much like inheritance. A week later, I asked for a copy of the freight paperwork because I wanted one normal thing to hold on to. The terminal manager printed the bill I had signed in Martinsburg, and the blue stamp beside the load number was still there, MLBK. This time, there was also a routing line beneath the Charleston destination, faint but readable, as if pressed through from another page, and it said, Millbrook Receiving, in block letters no one at the terminal could explain. The company records showed no secondary stop, no customer by that name, and no reason those words should have existed at all. The clock was worse. I had always said it ran 4 minutes slow in cold weather, the way a man shrugs off a draft from a bad seal or a brake light that only fails on rain-heavy days. After that night, I pulled the electronic logs from the truck, and every system that mattered showed the same thing. I left the marked detour and took the unknown right turn at exactly 11:52. The clock had not been behind. The rest of my life had been 4 minutes late. I got one frame of dashcam footage from Millbrook before the video dissolved into gray static. It showed my window half down, fog folding around the cab, and the old man in black leaning close enough that his hand rested on the door below the glass. His little finger bent sideways at the middle knuckle, healed crooked from an old break. My father had the same break, from catching his hand in a trailer latch long before he disappeared. And after I saw that frame, I stopped telling myself I had merely passed through somebody else's town. I tried to find the turnoff again in daylight, then in rain, then under a bright, hard winter. Some stories end when the screen goes dark, but others follow you long after the final word is spoken. Tonight's nightmare may be over, but there are still roads out there where people vanish without a trace. Lonely highways where truck drivers claim something impossible waits in the darkness beside the road. If you're brave enough to continue deeper into the unknown, then watch Star 7, Most Disturbing True Trucker Horror Stories next. Those stories are not just unsettling. They reveal the terrifying things people have encountered while driving through endless roads in the dead of night, far away from help, far away from civilization. You'll find the video waiting for you on the end screen. And if you enjoy true horror that feels disturbingly real, subscribe to Scary Dark Narrations and turn on notifications so you never miss another descent into fear. New nightmares are always waiting here, hidden in forgotten places, buried in real testimonies, and whispered by people who survived things they still cannot explain. Until next time, keep your doors locked, your lights dim, and be careful what you choose to watch alone at night, because sometimes the darkest horrors are the ones that actually happened.